Welcome, everyone. My name is Vaishali Jain, and I'll be your moderator today. And we wanted to thank you so much for joining us here at NetCom Learning, a market leader in promoting lifelong learning, training, and talent development solutions. So we're very excited to host today's webinar on big data and how to explain it and how to use it for your career. So presenting today's topic is Vincent Supa. Just a little bit about Vincent. Vincent is a global HR polymath and self-described member of Generation Flux. Using his operational experience across multiple industries spanning 3 continents, he now teaches at New York University and is an active member of HR Avant-Garde. As long as HR continues to be the gatekeeper to the jobs people want, Vincent will continue to give those around him, including those attending today's webinar, the prerequisite mindset to navigate their professional world to their advantage. And you can contact NetCom Learning to learn more about training services that can help you live a better life by having a better career. Now, please bear in mind that this is an overview of a very robust topic, and we offer a collection of technical and business courses that can be tailored towards your specific requirements. If you're interested in further discussion, you can make an appointment with one of our learning consultants through our website, netcomlearning.com. And today's session is also being recorded, so you'll get free access to the recording in the next 24 hours via email. Now we're just going to tell you a little bit more about NetCom Learning. NetCom Learning is an award-winning global leader in managed learning services, training, and talent development. We've trained over 100,000 professionals. We have over 11,000 corporate and government clients, and we've been named the top 20 IT training companies for 6 consecutive years in a row. And we're going to give you a quick overview of the logistics before we get started. So to start with, you have the option to adjust the window size to your liking. Simply hit the escape key and find the zoom button on our viewer. And everyone has been muted except for our presenters, so please feel free to submit any questions you have for the presenters in the questions pane, and we'll address them at the end of the session. A PDF copy of today's slides are also in the handout section of your GoToWebinar viewer. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Vincent to tell us more. Vincent?
The least you need to know about big data and how your career can benefit from it. Reach out to me through LinkedIn to suggest next month's topic. If it's a career or business related topic, I probably have an opinion and a pedagogy for it. Now, big data and how can it benefit your career? If you'd like to learn more, you could contact me through hravg.com. Today's agenda. If you ask people what big data is, they often say it's about a lot of data. But think about it. The world has always had a lot of data. It's really more about that. It's about datafication. This word is so new that even spell check functions do not yet know it is a real word. Datafication. Today's agenda, we will discuss how big data changes career paths of even the most unsuspecting, how big data changes the way businesses make their decisions, how big data changes who makes the decisions and the reshuffling of the balance of power, and finally, what big data skills can you bring to the office tomorrow to increase your value to the firm? Now, big data is a management tool, even if you have other employees perform the coding. Big data has many qualitative skills that are necessary in addition to the quantitative skills. So there's enough work for everyone. Big data is as ubiquitous as the internet is now, but it's often invisible to most people who are impacted by it. Now, before big data, we needed to hire CEOs with a lot of experience because we respected their gut instinct, again, based on years of experience. But now decisions that used to be made by gut, often from people that had years and years of experience, those decisions are now being made by data scientists and the managers who leverage data scientists. A data scientist will simply consume big data with an algorithm and mathematically arrive at the best decision. So the balance of power gets reshuffled a bit because experience is not valued as much as quantitatively arrived decisions. Now, the classic definition of datafication is a modern technological trend turning many aspects of our life into computerized data points that transform respective information into new forms of value. Now, data by itself has little to no value, but you get enough data points, we now have information. Now, what makes information valuable is when we have enough information that it becomes knowledge, and only knowledge built on information is actionable. Then above that, we have wisdom. Wisdom would be a precept that extends across disciplines. And then, of course, once you have insight built on top of your wisdom, well, that is the fulcrum that changes everything. Insight is a game changer that significantly impacts the entire ecosystem of whatever business or industry we're operating in. Now, I use the example of bowling. An amateur bowler might look at the bowling pins and often gutter the ball and occasionally knock down a few pins. But what they are taught is that instead of looking at the bowling pins at the end of the lane, they should look at the markers in the middle, in the beginning and the middle of the bowling lane. So the analogy we use is that the markers at the beginning of the bowling lane are the leading indicators, and knocking down the pins is the lagging indicator. So if you have the ball centered in the middle marker, you increase the probability that you will knock down the pin. So that's a leading indicator, the markers in the middle of the lane, versus the lagging indicator of actually knocking down the pins. In that sense, data, information, and knowledge, think of them as vital, important leading indicators, because the ultimate lagging indicator is where you have transformational insight that ultimately changes net income in the firm you're operating in. Now, again, the metaphor we use, algorithms like a Pac-Man eating big data. Again, algorithms eating big data. That is the metaphor that we're using. And this is an example of an algorithm. If we were to diagram an algorithm, you could also think of an algorithm as a function. Now, what is an algorithm? Well, we have a qualitative definition of a function and a quantitative definition of a function. And again, this is a good analogy to think about big data. Now, qualitatively, a function is an activity or purpose, natural or intended for a person or thing. Quantitatively, the definition of a function is a relationship or expression involving one or more variables. So qualitatively, a function is something that we might do. However, if we could mathematically express that, we might be able to predict the behavior in advance with a high degree of probability. So that is the metaphor that we're using. This is an example of what an algorithm looks like when it's scripted. Of course, this is beyond the scope of today's webinar, but I want to give you an example of what an algorithm looks like if you were to diagram it, and what it looks like if we were to actually script it. If you are not a coder, then you would employ coders that do this for a living. They would basically take your problem statement, they would take your hypothesis, and they would script it in a code. More about that later. Now again, the metaphor, I'm going to say it again, is algorithms eating big data. This is changing business as we are experiencing it today. Now let's look at transactional work. In the 1960s and 70s, every manager required secretarial functions. But just as voicemail and email obviated the manager's need of secretarial functions, think about a voicemail and email, which involved transactional work, could now be done by the manager, no longer requiring a separate employee to handle the transactional work. In that same vein, algorithms eating big data are now obviating the tactical managerial functions. This is why many organizations no longer have middle-level managers. In the past, middle-level managers basically directed the flow of information between the worker bees below them and the executives above them that dictated what work needed to be done. But that is becoming less and less necessary as big data and algorithms are automating tactical managerial functions. Strategy needs to consume data, and data without strategy has little value. Why? Because data without strategy is not actionable by definition. So the two go hand in hand. Now, what is the difference between analog and digital? Datafication is only possible because of the idea of digital representations of analog experiences. So here we have an example of a sine wave. And a sine wave is the smooth curve, the smooth black curve. That's an actual sine wave. It could be a sound of music. But a modified sine wave, those are the steps. The modified sine waves might be MP3, a digital representation of what used to be the analog sine wave. Now, digital versus analog. Let's use some examples. Again, if you were to listen to a vinyl record, right, we have analog. That is the top right square. The analog sound wave is a very close replication of the person actually singing. Now, a less close representation, but just as beautiful to the human ear, well, the digital sound wave interprets the continuous sound wave as a digital recreation. And this is what makes big data possible. Back in the day, experts used to analyze fingerprints with a magnifying glass. That's an analogy of an analog study. And now a digital fingerprint, obviously, is its digital counterpart. A sundial, is that analog or digital? Well, it is not discrete, so it is clearly analog. We have an hourglass, digital or analog? Well, that might be analogous to digital because the hourglass has a very specific discrete numbers of grains of sand. How about this type of thermometer? Digital or analog? Clearly it is analog because the mercury is a continuous representation of temperature. It is not a discrete measurement that you could easily divide. So this is an example or an analogy of analog. A roulette wheel, clearly digital. It's either going to be one number or the other number. There's no ambiguity. So this would be a discrete representation. This is clearly a digital analogy. Waterfall, well, just to give you an idea, if we were to look at water as a continuous wave, clearly this is an analogy of analog. But if we were to say, but each waterfall is composed of very specific molecules of water, well, again, that might be an analogy to digital. So we don't want to get caught up in semantics, but I want to help everyone understand what is the difference between analog and digital. Again, grains of sand, we might say it's digital because it has individual grains of sand, but if you're just looking at it from a higher level as the constant flow of sand, you might say it's analog. Clearly on the upper left, that's an example or illustration of analog because the colors are not discrete. One color gently overlaps into the next color with ambiguity, but on the lower right, this is an illustration of digital. It's either one color or another color. What about this photograph? The person says this photo was taken on film, not a digital camera, so clearly film is an illustration of analog, whereas clearly this is an illustration of a digital photograph exaggerated to make the point. Now, what about a drop of water? Well, that could be digital as a single data point. However, if you were to look at a drop of water as discrete individual molecules that you could theoretically count with an electron microscope, then clearly we could say that that drop of water is digital. So this is a form of social construct where we have to have our own consistent definitions whether something is analog or digital. And the ultimate example of social construct would be the philosophical question, if I have a pile of sand and we remove one grain of sand at a time, when is the pile no longer a pile? Clearly an example of social construct, meaning it is up to us to make that decision. Now on to the show. Big data. It is a broad term for data sets so large and complex that traditional data processing applications are inadequate. Want to hear a joke? A terabyte, petabyte, and a gigabyte walk into a bar. I want to give you a sense of scale. We have gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes, exabytes, zettabytes, and yottabytes, which is the largest measurement we have, each one being 1,000 times larger than the previous measurement. Well, to give you a sense of scale, the average individual attending this webinar most likely has less than 1 terabyte of data on all of their computers. Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, they might have as many as 1,200 petabytes of data, and internet traffic per year averages about 1 zettabyte. So this gives us a sense of scale. And again, going back into the 1980s, we had kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes, exabytes, zettabytes, and ultimately yottabytes. So this gives us a sense of scale at how much data we are currently producing. A yottabyte is 1,000 times, 1,000 trillion times of a gigabyte. Now, on to big data, the least you need to know. Big data manifests 3 basic shifts: from small to all, from clean to messy, and most importantly, from causation to correlation. And we will talk about each one. Now, let's give us a scope of traditional data sets and how much it has grown. Well, data grows analogous to the mathematical equation y equals tangent x, which you could see on the lower right screen. That means that data is growing exponentially. Now, about 17 years ago, 25% of the world's information was digital. The remainder was preserved in analog, vinyl records, or even actual hard copy books that you might buy in any bookstore. Now, digital data seems to be doubling every 2 to 3 years. Now, in 2014, right, compared to the year 2000, less than 2% of information is stored in analog, not because we've been storing less in analog in absolute terms, but simply because all new data being produced is almost exclusively digital. So right now, I would say over 99% of the data that we have is digital and not analog. Now, big data is not about a lot of data, as we said, because, well, we've always had a lot of data. Big data is this: the ability to render aspects of life into data points that were never quantified before. Or we could reword that as the ability to render aspects of life into data points that were never digitized before. This is datafication, and this is the new word of the day. Now, we talked about 3 shifts that big data is causing. We said from small to all. What that means is that before big data, we looked at samples of the population. That would be a lowercase n if anyone is versed in statistics. But going from small to all, big data does not look at samples of population. They look at the entire population. So we go from small to all. The second shift is from clean to messy. When you're looking at samples, each data point must be pristine. If you're trying to predict a presidential election and you're only sampling a couple of thousand people, each person in your sample might represent several 100,000 people in your total population. So if there's any ambiguity in your data point, you simply cannot use it. But when you're looking at the entire population instead of a sample, you could tolerate data that is not pristine. So again, small to all, clean to messy, and then instead of looking at what is causing an event, we look at what correlates to the event. Now, I want to give you an example of datafication that pre-existed computers, because often people say incorrectly that big data has to do with computers. Now, computers and the internet and storage have facilitated datafication, but datafication existed 500 years ago. Let's look at even before GPS was invented, latitude and longitude. This is an example of datifying location. So before longitude and latitude was invented, we might say, meet me in front of the mountain behind the tree at sunset. That is an analog illustration. But if we were to say, meet me 50 degrees latitude, 40 degrees longitude at exactly 6 p.m., that's an example of datifying location. So on Facebook, for example, words are treated as data. Friendships and likes and dislikes, this is all now datified from Facebook. Now, a Japanese engineer even datified the way people sat down. Previously, if I asked you, how do you sit, you would qualify the answer. I have good posture. I don't have good posture. I slouch. But what this Japanese engineer did, he quantified sitting down by measuring pressure points at 360 different locations between the upper back and the upper leg, and all 360 sensors were measured on a scale of pressure from 0 to 256. So datafication turns everything into a data point, and this Japanese engineer even quantified the way people sit down. So now sitting down is a signature. It's a great anti-theft device because the only way the engine is going to start is if the person sitting down is the owner of the car. Now, what are the tools for datafication? Well, inexpensive computers, powerful processors, basic statistics, and clever software, and of course, smart algorithms. But the first 4 of these 5 tools of datafication, they're all commodities, easily and widely available. So the differentiator to really leverage big data is having better algorithms. Now, let's give another example. Now, computers could do translations, right? Here's an example of computers computing lots of data, but not big data. You could download bilingual dictionaries in a computer. This is teaching computers to translate by bilingual dictionaries. But then in the 1990s, as an experiment, a company fed years and years of Canadian parliamentary transcripts into their databases. Why? Because Canadian parliamentary sessions are both recorded and transcribed in French and English. So they're able to statistically program it to infer which word of English might be the best alternative to French. So for example, the French word lumière might be a more appropriate substitute for the English word light than léger. Why? Because they're looking at the context, because they're comparing years and years of English and French conversation. So it has to do with probability. And this is why now electronic and automated translation services are so much more accurate, because they're not simply picking a word out of a dictionary, but they're looking at the context surrounded by the word and measuring the probability that that is a better word. Now, a quick review. Big data has 3 shifts: sampling the population to the entire population, needing pristine data to being able to tolerate messy data, and now causation to correlation. This is the most important implication of big data. Reasons on how the world works is now replaced with learning about association among phenomena. Now, knowing the causes of something is desirable, but it's harder to figure out. And for companies that are focused on net income, it is very expensive to know the cause, when simply knowing the association among phenomena can get you to the net income you want. And of course, there is a school of thought that causality is an illusion. For example, the history of science through millennia is A causes B, but then they find out that actually there was something between A and B that caused B, and so on and so on. So a lot of causation has to do with cognitive bias. Now, I'm going to give you 4 examples of big data: saving trucks, saving babies, saving epidemics, to saving buildings. Let's get started. Now, this trucking company placed sensors on parts of their trucks on the engine blocks to identify heat and vibrational patterns associated with failures leading to the trucks breaking down. By doing this, they were now able to predict a breakdown before it happened. And consequently, they would simply replace the part in the garage instead of on the side of the road, having a very expensive towing back to the garage. So what they did for the first year, they simply placed sensors, and for a year they did nothing but observe. And they looked at what trucks were breaking down and what trucks were not breaking down. And if they noticed that every time one part of the engine block vibrated ever so slightly, that it was associated with that truck breaking down 3 weeks later, well, after this experiment, they would simply tighten the screw, perhaps replace the screw on the engine block. They're not saying that this screw vibrating caused the truck to break down 3 weeks later, because there were many things happening in between that screw vibrating and the truck breaking down. They're simply saying that they don't care why, when it's simply less expensive for them to tighten the screw. So in this example, the data does not tell the company why the part is in trouble, but it reveals enough about the what, that association among phenomenon, to know that if they replace the screw now, they can avoid spending several $1,000s to having to tow the truck from the side of the road. And of course, this correlation can guide investigations into discovering the underlying cause, but that probably wouldn't help the company increase net income, so they're satisfied with the result that they have simply knowing the correlation. Another example, this was in Canada, that they monitored premature babies. Now, when saving lives, knowing something is likely to occur is more important than knowing the why. Now, they hooked up premature babies to sensors, and they measured over 1,000 data points a second. And I'm just giving a couple of examples for an illustration. They looked at respiration, oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, blood pressure, the amount of oxygen in the blood, fever. They looked at over 1,000 data points a second. And what they did was they observed. They saw which babies ultimately thrived 6 months later and which ones, unfortunately and heartbreakingly, did not thrive. So after observing this, this Canadian hospital was now able to use big data to spot infections in premature babies before the symptoms occurred. Again, they looked at an information flow greater than 1,000 data points per second, and they discovered correlations, not causation, but correlations between very minor changes in the vital signs of the babies and more serious problems that would develop weeks later. Another example by Google. This is one of my favorite examples. Big data can predict epidemics better than the Center of Disease Control. Now, the CDC tracks patient visits to clinics, so of course their information suffers from a 2-week reporting lag. So what Google did was they took the 50 million most commonly searched terms between 2003 and 2008, and they compared them against historical influenza and flu data from the Center of Disease Control. They were able to see after the fact which zip codes, based on the CDC's historical data, which zip codes had a flu epidemic. And then what Google did was they looked at all of those zip codes, the ones that had a flu epidemic and the ones that did not, and they correlated the most common, or the most common 50 million searches with the CDC's historical data on the outbreak of the flu. Now, because of that, going forward, Google is now able to predict flu epidemics real time. And this example illustrates all 3 shifts that we previously discussed. From small to all, well, Google did not look at a sample of the population. From small to all, they ran 100% of all of the searches for 6 years through their algorithm. They looked at the entire population. They identified 45 key searches that did in fact correlate to the CDC's data on flu outbreak. People searching for terms such as runny nose, body ache, fever, etc., etc. The second shift that big data causes is also illustrated in our example. Clean to messy. There were many searches that were imperfect. People had misspellings, people had incomplete phrases, and perhaps there could be someone attending nursing college that was actually doing a paper on the flu. That person was healthy, but they simply were doing a paper on the flu. So of course this would be an example of messy data, because the person is not sick, or it could be perhaps a mother in Hawaii searching about the flu because their daughter in Washington, D.C. is not feeling well. That would be an example of messy data. But because Google looked at the entire population, it could tolerate messy data. And the best illustration that big data is about correlation and not causation, will anyone attending this webinar claim that simply by typing in the flu symptoms into a search engine, that is what caused them to develop the flu? Of course not. But it's certainly correlated. So big data via searches predicts the outbreak real time compared to the CDC's traditional data analytics that lagged by 2 weeks because they were simply waiting on collecting the data from the clinics. Now let's look at the city of New York. The city of New York deals with illegally subdivided buildings that are more likely to catch fire. So the city of New York employs about 200 inspectors to respond to over 25,000 complaints a year with respect to overcrowding of buildings. And of course, it's an important issue because overcrowded buildings that are not up to code tend to cause a fire. So what did the municipality do? New York City created a database of almost 1 million buildings. Now, a corpus is a body of text to be analyzed. You could pull a corpus from Yelp reviews, from Amazon reviews, from anything. So step one would be to pull disparate sets of text and put them into a point of singularity. So it could be all of the reviews for a certain restaurant on Yelp. Now currently, 70% of all data is text. So pictures would have to be quantified under a separate protocol. So here we're talking about corpus, which involves text, which involves words. So step one, we pull disparate sets of text into a single point of singularity. And two, we could use any number of computer codes. R, for example, has a set of functions that automatically clean up a corpus by excluding data points that are simply superfluous to the analysis. So for example, after you download all of these Yelp reviews, the corpus will now be cleaned of commas, periods, words such as but, words such as and. These words do not give us more information. So part of corpus cleanup is to get rid of words and punctuation that do not really change the information that we're going to distill. And then we also clean up the file by reducing the corpus to primary words crucial to analysis. And then step three, we truncate words with a common stem. This is called stemming. So for example, the word engineer and engineering would both become the same word in our corpus. So think of stemming as an illustration of the mathematical analogy of number factoring versus least common denominator. Step four, we create a document term matrix. A mathematical matrix is used to describe the frequency of terms that occur in a collection of documents. Rows correspond to documents in the collection and columns respond to terms. And here we have a pictorial illustration. So again, we create a document term matrix that measures the frequency of words that remain after the corpus cleanup and after the corpus undergoes stemming. We are now left with primary outputs or primary words that enable us to count their repetition in each cell. We have datafied or quantified words that previously were only qualified. When we only qualify words, it prevents analysis. Qualified words is an illustration of analog, but quantifying words, meaning by assigning words numerical ranking, we have now datafied or digitized the words. So we've gone from qualified to quantified. And once we have quantified words, digitized its analog counterpart, we can now do lots of interesting stuff. And this is one of the most common examples. We have all seen word clouds. Word clouds are simply made possible because of the big data, the corpus cleanup, the stemming that goes on behind the scenes. A cluster of all the words in our cluster in your data matrix cluster. The result of this analysis is that we can now reduce our matrix to fewer columns. So in this illustration of a word cloud, the font size and even sometimes color is embedded with information. So for example, the larger the font, the more common the word loving and strong appeared in our corpus. Perhaps the color blue signifies that this word was commonly used in one part of the world, and red might signal that the word was used by another group or perhaps a group in another part of the world. So with all of this information, it is actionable. If we saw loving and strong, we might say we're on the right track, and the information that is actionable is to maintain the course. But if we saw negative words that were in large font, then we might say, you know what, the information that is actionable, we have to change the course. So this is a simple illustration of a word cloud made possible by big data. Now, Zipf's law is a law that states that given some corpus of natural language, English for example, the frequency of any word is inversely proportional to its rank in a frequency table. So a corpus has illustrated that the most common words in English, we could look at the x-axis, the, of, and, a, to. Well, the word the appears approximately twice as often as the word of. The word of appears approximately twice as often as the word and so on and so on. So this analysis is made possible by taking a corpus of perhaps the entire internet. Now, I use Zipf's law as a resume technique, as a way to increase information density, and I've received some feedback from our audience, so we will cover how to use information theory and information density to improve our resumes at a future webinar. Now, let me give you an illustration on what goes on behind a word cloud. How do we quantify words that used to be merely qualified? Well, with these data sets, meaning that we've quantified words, we could run a sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis means how do people feel about something? And then we could determine the occurrence or the rate of certain themes that are qualified as opinions. To determine if people like a restaurant, we might look at the words that the reviewers used via social media in the comments section. So if I were to, for example, download all of the reviews from Yelp from a certain restaurant, I might see words like and dislike, and I might see words such as love and hate. Those are the analog equivalent of words which are merely qualified. We can't do much when we qualify information. But if we assign numerical values, if we say that every time we see the word like in a review, we give that a 7, dislike, we give a -7, we assign a +10 to the word love and a value of -10 to the word hate, well, now we have quantified or quote-unquote digitized our words, and it is now ready for analysis. So pre-established words and narrative responses are now embedded in the clusters that we developed, and these clusters can now signal positive or negative statements about a movie, about a restaurant, or even a Hammaker Schlemmer customer review. Qualitatively, we quantify the weakness of strength of these signals. I liked it, I disliked it, I loved it, or I hated it. And we determine words that correlate to having liked or disliked the movie or the restaurant, and to what degree along a predetermined discrete continuum. So the decision that we made was we decided to assign a value of 7 to like instead of 6 or 9, for example. Is that correct or incorrect? Well, that's sentiment analysis. We make a decision on what values we want to assign to the words, and once we do that, we let the analysis take off. Now again, refer to our previous slide where we talked about a real sine wave and a modified digital sine wave. Well, the actual words qualified are analogous to the actual sine wave, the smooth black curve going up and then going down. Once we assign values to the words, +10, -10 for love and hate, well, those are discrete numerical rankings assigned to each word, and that is analogous to a modified sine wave, the steps that we see in blue on this pictorial illustration. So again, the difference between analog and digital is that an analog signal is continuous, while a digital signal is a series of discrete values representing information. So once we quantify values to the words, we're able to do a word cloud because we're able to run our analysis. This is a common example of big data. This is how people know, do people like my restaurant or do they not like my restaurant? Yes, you could read some of the reviews, but if you have 500,000 reviews, obviously you're not able to read everyone, but you are able to run a rigorous analysis using the techniques we just discussed. Now, to determine what traits can predict future outcomes, like which buildings will go up in fire and which ones will not, we always look at historical data to figure out what those correlations are. So the first thing we do is simply observe or analyze historical data before we make any type of intercession, before we make any type of action to change the outcome. We simply need to observe what has happened already. And then we correlate judgments to see if our correlations can predict from groupings, meaning which ones predict against other data sets. This is an example of cross-validation and is again determined by looking at historical data sets. In our example of buildings in New York City, we could cross-validate them against buildings in other municipalities. So this whole idea of being able to digitize what previously used to only be qualified, this is what we mean by gut instinct is simply not as valuable. And now we have machine-to-machine learning. Machine-to-machine learning is a technology that enables network devices to exchange information and perform action without manual human assistance. Think about this. We could now tweak the algorithm to become better and better without human assistance. We now have master algorithms that script other algorithms at an at-need basis free of human interaction. And this is what's replacing traditional managerial jobs, just how voicemail and email replaced traditional transactional secretarial job functions. And the firms that still employ these types of managerial jobs, directing the information between executives and the worker bees, well, even firms that do continue to employ these types of managers, they feel less pressure to keep those salaries at pace with inflation over time because there is a substitute already waiting in the wings. And this is why big data impacts the careers of even the most unsuspecting. And with any analysis of the externalities, we need to shift our internal response to maximize the outcome we want, especially within our own careers. Now, machine learning can test statistical models. For example, it could even test against known political party membership and then update the algorithm and make the algorithm even more accurate at correlating which data sets correlate to which political party as new data comes in. In machine-to-machine learning, we let the data points come in, it refreshes, and then it updates the algorithm to be even more accurate. I remember watching a segment where a data scientist said that just by viewing the first 19 likes on anyone's Facebook page, he could determine with a very high probability what political party in the United States that person belonged to, whether a Democrat or whether a Republican. Now keep in mind, these likes on Facebook had nothing to do with politics, had nothing to do with political affiliation, but he could simply infer political affiliation by the first 19 likes that a person clicked on their Facebook page, even if those likes were completely apolitical. Because he's not saying that liking a certain movie causes you to vote Republican and Democrat. He's simply saying that it is mathematically beyond dispute based on historical data that people who like this type of movie correlate to people that might be a Republican or a Democrat. And this is why we have more targeted advertising. Now, what could we do tomorrow at the office based on what we learned today? Even for those of us that hate coding and hate math, well, there are plenty of qualitative soft skills that big data requires. So tomorrow, you could take inventory of the data you already collect. You might look at your internal data kept in your HRMS system, and even data kept in your ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning System, your customer relationship module, your accounting module, your inventory module, your supply chain module. So you want to look at all of your internal data and basically write it down. You want to look at the external data that's available that you can access, especially under the Freedom of Information Act, which we will discuss in a subsequent slide. You could also access data externally that you could legally purchase from vendors such as Yelp, Facebook, DoubleClick, etc. And then you want to create a glossary of terms. We call this a data definition dictionary. And I use headcount as an example. Often people think headcount is straightforward. No. One subsidiary might count headcount as headcount at the end of the month. Another one might take headcount at the beginning and the end of the month and average it in. Another subsidiary, the same company, might take headcount at the midpoint. And another subsidiary might take headcount every day and divide it by 30 days in the month. So it's not always clear what the definition of every data set is. So something that we can all do tomorrow is take inventory of all the data that we already have at our disposal and simply create a glossary of data definitions. 2, determine what decisions you want to derive from big data. You select your most pressing business problem that your company has, and I always recommend using the Pareto 80-20 rule. And then in plain English, simply state your problem statement. That gives clarity to what you hope to resolve. And then you write down all of your independent variables. The independent variables would come from the inventory that you took in our previous step, where you wrote down all of the data sets at your disposal. You take the ones that you believe might be pertinent to solve your problem. And then finally, you determine your dependent variable. That would be the preferred outcome to your problem statement. So for example, you might want to hire more salespeople that could sell more than 30 euros a year. So what do is you look at all of the data that you already collect, and you look at historical data for my salespeople that have always sold more than 30 euros a year. What traits did they have in common? Right? Those traits would be the independent variable. Your dependent variable would be salespeople that sell more than 30 million euros a year. And then you can go to LinkedIn, for example, with an API application program interface and simply look for people on LinkedIn that also have those traits. So the next step is you want to actually write down your hypothesis. And in subsequent webinars, we could talk about how to do that. But you want to write down your hypothesis. And so if you look at step 1, 2, and 3, it has nothing to do with mathematics, nothing to do with coding, and it still involves plenty of value-added work. Step 4, you contact your IT department, or perhaps you have a data science department, and if not, STEM is an acronym for science, technology, engineering, mathematics. You contact STEM graduate students or PhD candidates in the universities in your area, and then you turn them into data scientists. You tell them what your hypothesis is, you give them access to your inventory of data, and they will code your hypothesis. What does that mean? They will write the algorithm that will eat the big data that you have presented to them. So these are all things that we can do tomorrow morning, and they have nothing to do with math or coding. Now, briefly, the Freedom of Information Act is a federal law that allows for the disclosure of previously unreleased information. People think it's just about documents. No, it's also about databases. So, for example, people that want to write apps for the MTA, through the Freedom of Information Act, they could receive troves and troves and terabytes of data on the MTA's ridership. So the Freedom of Information Act is a way to get big data that you could use for your analysis. Now again, you have a business problem you're trying to solve. You write this business problem in plain English. Then you state it in a hypothesis. And then you collect data from the systems you already have it in place. You have it coded either by a STEM graduate student or by your IT department, or from some of us attending today's webinar by yourselves, and then you test the hypothesis, because we're only looking at historical data, and once we test the hypothesis and it proves correct, or we tweak it until it is correct, now we could predict future outcomes. Now, Steve Jobs has a quote that says, "Everybody in this country should learn how to program a computer because it teaches us how to think." Now, coding is now the new literacy. They're teaching it in kindergarten and first grade now. Now, for those of us that are adults, well, there are coding classes all around. Most are online, a few are on site, some free, and some are at a cost. Now remember, most of us will not be competing with other coders. We will just be competing against other marketers, HR, or financial professionals who know nothing about coding. So 100 years ago, the question was, should I learn how to read? 20 years ago, it might be, should I learn how to use the internet? Today is, should I learn how to use coding? Now again, you're not going to compete against coders, but against your counterparts that you're competing for with jobs that know nothing about coding. There are many program languages. Which one should you choose? Well, two popular ones are Python and R, and you need to make an assessment, do your own research, and decide, if you're a novice, what's the first coding language you would like to learn. A little bit about R. I like it because it's free. It contains embedded tools to pull external data. For example, it helps us do the corpus cleanup that we discussed previously. And it has tools that scrape data from any website, Reuters, for example. And then it also allows for text mining. Now remember, word clouds is an example of text mining, and these tools are already embedded in R, which again is free. A little background, R was written in the C language. Coders wrote functions in C to create macros in R to pull data. And this might be analogous to writing macros in Excel. And again, R will let you pull data directly into a corpus. So I like R, but you want to do your own research. Now remember, you're not competing against other coders, but against others in your field that know nothing about coding. So by teaching yourself how to code, you could have a much better conversation with the coders that you hire. Now, just how ubiquitous is big data? Why is it so important to learn? Well, look at Facebook. It accomplished what democratic governments tried but failed to do. Build a database of all of its citizens. So big data is all around us. Just as Google's augmented reality glasses, which are not commercially successful on the retail level, but they are used professionally by airplane mechanics, et cetera, Google's augmented reality glasses has datafied the gaze. Twitter datafies stray thoughts, and LinkedIn has even datafied professional networks. Analog, you might say that you have a robust professional network, but datafied, you might say that you have a network that exceeds 700 professionals. We now have the floor of shopping arenas as one big giant surface-based computer. Okay, this is big data that impacts even shoppers. So if you ever downloaded a coupon that was texted to you, well, under the terms and condition of receiving that 20% off coupon, you have now agreed to have your phone turn into a GPS device. So now the store is able to track, with your consent, what aisles did you walk down or ignore, in what sequence did you browse the aisles, how long were you in the store, what is the length of time between your last store visit, and how long did you linger, not moving, in front of the cereal aisle, and then when you finally checked out, what cereal wound up in your cart. So what stores do is they use big data to compare viewing patterns with what wound up in your shopping cart. And they script algorithms to better predict the independent variables, meaning what they should stock on the shelves, with the dependent variable of their revenue thresholds, meaning what did you actually purchase. So again, what is your role in the big data world? Well, to discover latent needs. Latent needs are needs so basic that even people themselves are not aware that they have those needs. And the mere ability to define a problem is exactly what is needed to precede its solution. Again, big data has a qualitative and a quantitative side. And if you hate math, the qualitative skills to harness is develop observational skills to separate the signal from the noise. Again, take inventory of your existing data, learn how to develop hypotheses to test, learn how to access external data from the Freedom of Information Act, for example, and then be that liaison between your internal data and the data that you can acquire externally, and develop networks with STEM students in the universities around your area. Now again, if Henry Ford queried big data to discover what customers wanted, he'd come up with faster horses who required less water. So in a big data world, the traits we want to develop is creativity, intuition, intellectual curiosity, and leveraging errors and risk-taking. Now, here's an example of figure skating and the X Games. In figure skating, you have to be perfect or you come in last place. And in the X Games, you could fall off your skateboard and you could still win first place. If you ever seen figure skating in the Olympics, if they fall, they're very upset. But if someone falls in the X Games, they just get right back up. So remember, don't be afraid to fail. Business is not figure skating, it's the X Games. And if you fail, have a quick time to market to failure that mitigates your loss and allows you to harvest what did not work for your next initiative. Remember, capitalism without failure is like a religion without sin. If you would like to learn more, reach out to me through hravg.com. I hope you join us for our next webinar on April 27th, and I'll be looking to your emails to decide on what next month's topic would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. That was very informative. Now, we have a special promotion for the recommended courses for this webinar. If you enroll yourself for the courses mentioned below, we'll add 15% to your savings. And in order to avail the discount, use promo code WBD3003. And this offer is valid until April 14th. We're going to go ahead and launch a quick poll to find out who is interested in taking more courses related to this topic. So I'll go ahead and launch that poll. In the meantime, we'll take one quick question. Give me 1 second over here. Okay. Anyone who does have questions, you can go ahead and type them in the questions pane and we'll address them. The first question, Vincent, is I've heard the term velocity when talking about big data. What does this mean exactly?
Velocity refers to both the speed at which data comes at us, and for companies this is now often real time, and velocity also refers to how quickly do you need to make that information actionable before it becomes irrelevant.
Okay. And won't accessing the data on my company's ERP system slow everything down for employees and customers who rely on these company databases?
It absolutely would. That's why companies never use the production database when they do their big data analysis. They mirror the data often every 24 hours, and data scientists are accessing a data mart or a data warehouse, which is a copied mirror reflection of the production database. So again, we don't use the production database. We make a copy of it that the data scientist will use.
Okay, great. So that's it for the questions. We are out of time, so if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to send them to webinar@netcomlearning.com at any time. And we have several more informative webinars coming up. You can check those out on netcomlearning.com/webinars to register. And please follow us, our social media pages, on our social media pages to get the latest technology updates. You can refer to the GoToWebinar chat window for the links. And we hope you found this webinar informative, and we look forward to seeing you back here with us soon. Feel free to tell your friends and colleagues about our webinars and other courses, and we hope everyone has a great day. Thank you, Vincent, and thank you everyone again for joining us.